Okay, so let's continue our introduction to computer systems. And today's lecture, we're going to continue the repetition structures. What do we mean by repetition structures? The loops. We have studied the for loops and the while loops. As promised last time, I will talk about nested loops. But before talking about nested loops, I will talk about input validation, which is an application that requires تستلزم more than one loop in your program. Those loops can be consecutive loops, one loop after the other, or they can be nested loops, one loop inside another loop. This will serve as a motivational introduction, مقدمة وتمهيد for the topic of nested loops, which I will present in more details in Tuesday's lecture, inshallah. Okay? So this is one thing. The second thing, maybe your TAs will talk about it in more details in the lab tomorrow, is the lab final exam. We should have a lab final exam, but lab final exam. But maybe as you heard that in Ramadan, that lecture time, lab times will be much shorter. So it will be difficult, or I will not have enough time to solve a full problem during the allotted slot في الوقت المتاح. So in that case, I will try to have the lab final exam before Ramadan. Before Ramadan means next week. طيب. So this week, the lab, you will have more training, which is Monday and Wednesday, 22 and 24. So some people have their lab on 22nd and 24. We will have good training on the input validation, and because maybe the lab exam comes earlier than you expected, which will be then on the 29th and of April and the 1st of May, the topic of the lab will be again about input validation. Okay, so it will be only about this topic. It will not be comprehensive, covering the whole course. So today in lecture we'll have input validation. Tomorrow in your lab you'll have input validation. In your tutorials you'll have input validation. So in that case you have enough training 3 times during this week. Next week you will have the lab final exam on a problem on input validation.
Only input validation.
Only input validation. But input validation is a big problem. So we'll study today together, because I heard from many TAs that during the lab and tutorial you already understand. So some TAs told me, we think that the students don't even need the tutorial. They already understood well enough during the lectures. But anyway, we'll have enough time for training, because what do you do in the lab final exam? In the lab final exam, you don't draw flow charts. You don't answer true or false questions. You write a code that performs or prints the output that is required. So let's talk about input validation. What is input validation? Why is it needed? And how do we implement it? And as a preparation, today's lecture will not have flow charts, just writing code. So what is input validation? And why is it needed? As an introduction, if a program reads bad data as input, it will produce the bad results, bad data as output. They call it in your textbook, garbage in, garbage out. If you throw in garbage, يعني اللي احنا بنقولها بلغاتنا بلاش الجاربج، هم بيستخدموا يعني مسألة مش نظيفة، بنقول ايه؟ لو سببت حد هيردها لك، صح؟ Same for your computer. If you insult your computer هيردها لك. If you enter bad data that is invalid, then the results will also be invalid. The programs should be designed to accept only valid or good or correct data. So in that case, since your program doesn't know if the data that you input is valid or invalid, then you should add an additional part to your program that validates the data, that inspects the data, that checks the data before it is being processed. If it is invalid, it should reject this data and ask the user to enter new data that is correct. We have seen a similar example last time. Do you remember the example with the continue and break? What did the example with the continue and break do?
A negative number.
Yes, we entered an invalid data, which is a negative grade. Usually, and inshallah, all the time, students don't get negative grades. So if you add a negative grade, then the average grade will be corrupted. سوف تكون يعني ملوثة أو يعني من مش عارف corrupted. So in that case, we tried to solve this problem, but not in a very good approach. We tried the break. If you enter an incorrect data, the program immediately stops. This was not a good approach, but at least it does not accept this data. We tried another thing. If you enter incorrect data, continue, skip that data, and continue asking for more data. But then you lose your opportunity, تفقد الفرصة to enter this data. Why? Because we entered, if you remember example from last time, we entered positive data, accepted. Negative data, not accepted but skipped, it is still counted. Here what I want to do, if you enter a negative data, give a warning, number one. Number two, give another chance, another opportunity, فرصة أخرى to the user to enter the correct data, not stop completely. So this is how we should do it, not with continue or break. But at that time we had only studied continue and break, so this is what we did. Example number one. Write a program that converts weights from kilograms to pounds. Okay? And the formula is 1 kilogram equals 2.2 pounds. So we must multiply the kilogram weight by 2.2 and get the output. Very simple example. Except that your program should validate its input. What do you think validate here means? What is unacceptable as a weight?
Positive number.
Minus بالضبط. Yeah, positive are accepted, negative are unaccepted. So unacceptable. There are no people who weigh in a negative weight. It cannot happen even on other planets. Negative weight. So unlike, for example, converting temperatures, we have positive temperature and negative temperature. But for weight, we must be. What happens if you enter a negative kilogram weight? It will produce negative pound weight because you throw in garbage, so you get back garbage. سببت الكمبيوتر رجع لك المسبب. طيب. So this is our first attempt. Our first attempt without input validation. This is how we would write the program before the midterm. If you did not study input validation and loops, this is how we would write it. We have two floats, the kilogram weight and the pound weight. And it prompts the user to enter the weight in kilograms and see in the value inside the k variable. It multiplies the k variable by 2.2, which is the conversion from kilograms to pounds, and then it counts, it prints weight in pounds is p, the value of the variable. If we enter a negative number, it will produce a negative number. It does not care if your data is valid or invalid. So for that case, we should add data checker. How can we add? What are your opinions? What do we need?
شرط شرط
Hmm?
لازم في سيف.
Naji said it in Arabic, we need shart, we need a condition, we need an if statement. So let's do it with an if statement and see what happens. I'm going to add an if statement. The most natural way is to add an if statement. If the input kk, which stands for the kilogram weight, is negative, then print some error message, error negative weight, please re-enter, and then give another chance for the user to enter a new value of kk. And in that case, print, now at that point you can perform the formula and transform into pounds and print the pp value. Okay? Is this correct? Why not?
لأنه راح يسأل مرة واحدة بس بعدين راح يرجع مرة.
If the user عنيد, stubborn, and the first time he enters a negative number, and the first time he enters a negative number, second chance also negative number, then this is the program will fall again in the same trap. سيقع في نفس الفخ مرة أخرى. No? If you enter, and this is what many students do, they say, I entered a negative number, so it produced the error message, then I entered a positive number, so it computed the value. So he says, yes, my program is working correctly, but he does not get full mark. Why? Because in my previous program, if you enter a negative number, then in your second chance, في الفرصة الثانية, you also enter a negative number, your program will fail for the second time. So is it understood up to now? So the if condition gives you the possibility for a second chance only. After that, the program will fail again. So what should we have?
Have loop. لازم loop.
Yes, loop. وانت بتقول ايه؟ نسيت اسمك. فواز, yes, Fawaz. Fawaz said we need if else. If else is better than if, but it gives a third chance. After the third chance, it fails again. So you must keep if else, if else, if else, if else, if, until how many times? If you put 10 times, if else, if, then the user will enter 11 times incorrect. It will not work. If you put 100 if else, if, your program will become very big, very difficult to write, and maybe I write 1,000 times incorrect. So at the 101 time, it will fail. So I want something that keeps repeating until you enter the correct value, which is the loop. The loop is the only structure that keeps repeating until the condition is broken. So what should we replace the if? How?
For or while.
Just a while. If we just replace the if with a while, it will keep repeating forever. Not forever, as long as keep repeating طالما you enter negative values. So this is exactly the same code. Okay? I replace the if with a while. First time, if I enter, there are many situations. Maybe the first time I entered a positive number. From the first time, what will happen? Am I going to enter the while loop? So if the first kk is positive, then the while loop, exactly, the condition is not going to be satisfied, and I skip the loop, completely skip the loop, and I perform the operation. How about if the first time is negative, but the second time is positive? Like the if. First time is negative, then kk is negative, then I enter the while loop. Once I enter the while loop, I input another kk, number 2, and this time it is positive. Then when I try to loop back, it exits the loop. How about if I enter first, second, third, until 100 times, all negative, 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 negative. Then, exactly, 2, 3, 4, until 100, they all stay inside the loop. So this is the good thing about using the loop. You get stuck inside the loop, تعلق في اللوب, until what is the only condition so that I exit the loop.
positive number.
بالظبط. enter a positive number. عايز تخرج من الوحلة يبقى enter a positive number. So in the 101st time I enter a positive number. So in that case, since it is positive, I can exit the loop and compute finally the value. كده واضح؟ So I tried here another example that tests the loop. I kept entering negative, negative, negative numbers 4 times. It gets stuck inside the loop until I enter a positive number. Then the condition is broken and I exit the loop. This is a situation where a while loop, because I heard a student that said we can use a for loop. And in the previous lectures, I said you can interchangeably use while loops or for loops. يمكنكم الاختيار بحرية either while or for loop. But I would say this is a program where a while loop is easier than a for loop. You still can do it with a for loop, but it will be difficult to use. So it is easier to use a condition controlled loop, which is the while loop. واضح؟ نصعب شوية؟ يا ريت. طيب, example number 2. This program asks you to print the multiplication table of a user input number. If the user enters 3, then your program is going to write 3 times 1 equals 1, 3 times 2 equals 2. Even the computer does not like the multiplication table. Okay? 3 times 2 equals 2 until 3 times 10 equals 3 times 2 does not equal 2. طب قاعدين ساكتين ليه؟ طيب. How do I know that it is from 1 to 10? Because this is what I'm asking you, and I think this was one of the problems maybe in the lab or the tutorial or both. But your program should validate the user input. I have decided that this program will only compute the multiplication tables for numbers between 1 and 5 inclusive. And if you enter 15, it is not going to print the multiplication table. If I enter even 6, it is not going to enter the multiplication table. So the input doesn't have to be a wrong input so that we validate it. Sometimes I have a restriction. Sometimes I decide that I want to compute the multiplication table for numbers between 1 and 5 only. If you enter another number, it is not accepted. Not because it is wrong, because I don't want it. In that case, it should not pass the validation test. So in that case, how would we do it? Same thing. First, we have a while loop. A while loop that performs the validation. So this is the validation step. Then we have a for loop. A for loop that does the table part. Table section. Okay? So first thing, I'm going to ask the user to enter a number n. Please enter a number and see in that number. It is an integer number. Maybe I should have indicated here. User input integer number. I'll try to be careful, more careful in the exam. Integer number. And this number should be between 1 and 5 inclusive. What does it mean? That n equals 1 is acceptable, n equals 2 is acceptable until, yes, n equals 5 are all acceptable. Any other numbers are not acceptable. What are the other numbers? So many numbers. 0, minus 10, 15. So what is the formula for those other numbers? All the numbers less than 1 are not acceptable. And all the numbers bigger than 5 are not acceptable. Now this is the logical problem that many students fall into, and that I will deduct 1 point if you make. Is it an or an and? Some students said or, some students said and. So what are the numbers that I want? I want the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want ما نرغب فيه that n آسف that
one of them must be true.
That n is larger than or equal to 1 and n less than or equal to 5. This is what is desired. المرغوب فيه المطلوب. But I wrote my while condition using the opposite. The opposite condition. The opposite condition tells me the numbers that are not wanted. So the numbers that are required, that are wanted, are the numbers greater than or equal to 1, and at the same time, less than or equal to 5. So what is the opposite range? المدى المكمل, the complementary range. This part and this part. Can you have a number that is both less than 1 and at the same time larger than 5? قول لي رقم كده في نفس الوقت أصغر من 1 وأكبر من 5. مستحيل. A number can either be less than 1, and in that case it will be rejected, or a number can be larger than 5, and in that case also it will be rejected. So the opposite, ما اسموش opposite, the complement المتمم المكمل for this condition, عكس الcondition دي, is n less than 1 or n larger than 5. Maybe you are confused. You want to write it another way. Very simple. Do you understand this one? N larger than or equal to 1 and n less than or equal to 5, which is what is desired. خلاص. Then put this condition this way. Not n larger than or equal to 1 and n less than or equal to 5. This is the easiest way. خلاص. While not n larger than 1 and n less than 5. Or you can write it while n less than 1 or n larger than 5. Both are the same. Because what you want is those numbers. So what you reject is outside this range. Outside this range means not inside this range. واضح؟ This is how you write the condition, and try to think about it mathematically. You cannot have a number that is at the same time less than 1 and larger than 5. It cannot be on both sides. It can be only at the middle. So this is why at the middle is larger than 1 and less than 5. But outside it becomes or, because you cannot be on both sides at the same time. So this is how we write our this is how we write our validation step. بالضبط. Inside is تقاطع الاثنين. You intersect this region with this region. But outside is the union of the outside this way and this way. Do you take abstract mathematics or discrete mathematics course? Maybe you will take it later, this course. It talks about this thing in more details, but here we just understand it naturally. أنا عايز رقم يكون موجود in this range يعني larger than this and smaller than this, then it is included. You don't want in this range, then it is smaller than the smallest one or larger than the largest one. خلاص كده outside the range. And on a straight line, you only have those two options, either inside an range or outside a range. داخل المدى أو خارج المدى. So here, if the while the condition is not satisfied, which is the number is not inside, which means n less than 1 or n larger than 5, you keep looping and write error. The number should be between 1 and 5. Please re-enter that number, and you see in again and again and again until the user enters a number that is in the valid range between 1 and 5. Then in that case, you are going to print the multiplication table, maybe with a header, the multiplication table is, and then you use your for loop. But here, the for loop is as follows. From 1 to 10, you are going to print n, which is the number you just entered, times c, which are the numbers from 1 to 10, like this, 1 to 10, and finally, you print the equal sign and the result. For example, if we enter 3, it is going to print 3 times 1 equals 3. And then it is going to print 3 times 2 equals 6, and so on until 3 times 10 equals 30. الكونديشن ده مظبوط. This is the condition to stay in the loop. When do I stay in the loop? When should I stay inside the loop? If the user enters a non-acceptable number. So, مو صحيح if you mean that not acceptable number. Yes, we should put here the non-acceptable number. This is the validation loop. Like here. We should put here only the non-acceptable numbers. خلاص? Because if it is not acceptable, you stay in the loop. But if you enter the acceptable number, you will not enter the loop. خلاص? So the while loop will always contain the non-acceptable values, the rejected values. Because if the value is accepted, then okay? So this is the output. For example, I tried first to enter a non-acceptable number, 6. It was not accepted, and it gave me the error message. Number should be in the range 1 to 5. Please re-enter. So I entered again a non-acceptable number to check that it is not an if. This is how I will test your code in the lab exam. In the lab exam, you will write your code, but I will test your code. I will test your code. Maybe you wrote an if statement, not while. How do I know? I must enter multiple incorrect input. So in that case, I know if you did while or if. Then finally, I entered an acceptable number, even though it is on the boundary, but still acceptable. And it is going to print the multiplication table. In the previous example, we have seen a program with 2 loops. خلاص? But are those 2 loops intersecting one inside the other in sequence? Those 2 loops are in sequence. Loop number 1 for validation, separate from the loop number 2 for printing the multiplication table. واضح? So your program can contain any number of while loops. I said something very quickly. Maybe some students noticed it, maybe some students did not notice. Can we have 2 intersecting loops? No, this is incorrect. خلاص? We will not talk about it, but if you ever do something like this, your program is not going to compile. Because you get here, and this loop wants to loop, but this loop ends before this loop finishes, so it's incorrect. What you can have is 2 things.
Loop after loop, loop inside.
الله ينور. loop after loop, 2 loops in sequence, or loop inside loop, but you cannot intersect the loops. So we have seen the first example, loop after loop. Now I'm going to show you an example of intersecting, loop inside loop, which is nested loop. Example 3 about nested loop, write a program that reads the number of students ng in a class, and then all the ng grades entered one by one. Have we seen this example before? Yes, of course. And computes the average grade. Except that your program should validate each grade one by one. So you enter the first grade, validate that this grade is acceptable. For example, for your midterms, what is the range of the grades? From 0 to 25. This is what we do when we enter as professors your grade on the portal system. If I enter a grade that is less than 0 or larger than 25, maybe some student is wasta and I want to enter a grade more than 25, then the system should reject. So this is what we say here. The program should validate each grade one by one to make their inside the range 0 to 25. And at the same time, it should read the grades. So here we have 2 loops. One loop to read the grades. So this is the loop for grades. But each grade should be validated. So I have another loop inside the outer loop, inside the main loop, for validation. تتحقق من each input data is correct. What do we call loop inside loop? Nested loop. So nested loop, we have seen nested if, you remember? Nested decision structure. And if inside an if. Now, this is our first example of loop inside loop. Can be for inside for. Can be while inside for. Can be for inside while. Can be while inside while. Any loop inside another loop. Okay? Since this topic is interesting and important, the next lecture it will be only about examples of nested loops. Not with validation, but just nested loops. For inside for, for inside while inside for. كده. So here what should we do? We had our program from last time. Our program reads first, asked for the number of grades. A number of students, yes. Yeah, number of grades or number of students. يعني we assume that each student has 1 grade only. خلاص؟ عدد enter the number of students, ng. So it is going to loop. This ng controls the number of iterations of the outer loop. It controls how many times I should read a grade. It is going to read 10 grades, 15 grades. Of course, this is not a good program. If I write a good program, I should also validate ng. Maybe I enter ng negative number. Do we have negative number of students? No. Maybe I enter ng 1 million. You are going to die before finishing entering. So maybe we should limit the maximum number, maybe 100 students per time. So this is maybe one idea for the final exam. I can make validation for ng and validation. You can have a program with more than one validation. Validation for the number of students and validation for each grade. But here, because we don't have enough time during lecture, I put short examples. So I assume ng is correct, and the user, the program is going to ask the user to enter ng grades. For example, 5 grades. So please enter a grade. Then we perform the validation on the value of the grade. Grades. Okay, what should we put inside the condition of the while? The rejected grades. Grades al-marfuda should be inside the condition. So to know the rejected grades, we must know the acceptable grades. What are the acceptable grades? From 0 to 25 inclusive. So what is rejected? Outside. So this is rejected, which is N or G less than 0. And what else is rejected? G equal greater than 25. Can we have a grade that is both less than 0 and larger than 25 at the same time? No, it's either less than 0, reject, or larger than 25, reject. So we put here the rejection condition. G less than 0 or G larger than 25. In that case, you should get stuck inside the loop. يجب أن تعلق داخل اللوب until you enter a grade that satisfies the acceptable condition, which will be greater than 0 and smaller than 25. In that case, I will exit the loop, and in that case, I can finally add this grade into the running total. Do you remember sum? Sum is our running total variable. The accumulator, ممتاز. Running total or accumulator. And in that case, I'm not skipping. I am waiting until the user enters the correct grade, and then I add it to the sum, and it does not affect the sum because it is a correct grade. And finally, I print the average as sum divided by NG, which is the number of students. Because now I am sure that I entered NG grades. I did not enter less grade. I did not skip any student because I keep waiting until each student is entered the correct grade. So if we try to run this program, I asked for 5 students. Okay? So I'm going to enter 5 grades. The first grade of which I entered as 23, then 25. Then instead of writing 23, I mistyped it as 32. Is 32 acceptable? Should I completely exit the program? This is not a good approach to exit or stop or skip. This is where I get the error message and input the correct grade, and it continues. It continues until I have entered 5 correct grades. So this one is not computed. This one is not computed as a grade. And this is what the while loop does here. This while loop stops the counter from incrementing. Yani, not only I'm stuck here and I'm waiting for the user to enter a new grade, not just that, the counter is not incrementing as long as I'm entering incorrect grades. So what happened here is that I entered an incorrect grade. The counter was C equals 1, correct, accepted. C equals 2, correct, accepted. C equals 3, incorrect, not accepted. I will enter another one, 23. Did the counter increment here? No. Why? Because I'm still stuck inside the loop. I'm CN, wrong numbers, but the C is not incrementing, the counter is not incrementing as C++, until I enter a correct number and I exit the while loop and I add it. Then C is incremented as C++. واضح? So in that case, NG is the number of correct grades and the average is 22.4. واضح؟ شكرا. I finished.